Hi, folks, with us today, Taskless today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio, radio, no pictures. Listen to this in your car as you're driving along live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the quite valid and reasonable question that have been put about recently in some quarters of the media when it's why should Australia or Canada or any of the West stop mass migration or reduce mass migration or reduce it to skilled migration when Australia, for example, Canada too, and New Zealand, other places, Australia has a rich history of taking in large numbers of migrants, and they integrate, nicely, and everything works out. It's seamless. The economy benefits, and so on. And they point to the mass post-war migration, particularly say the 1960s and early 1970s, and they point to this and say, well, look how easy it was. I mean, why should it be different today? And this is used as a reason, if not an underpinning sort of justification for ongoing mass migration. Look at how well it's always worked out. Now, if we go back to the 1960s, and I'll just pick 1970 as, if you like, the focal point of this. If we look at the migration going on at the time, it was say 120,000, this is into Australia, 120,000 a year. If you look at the population of Australia at the time, then it was the equivalent today to say 350 to 400,000 immigrants, which is nearly 500,000 last year, but roughly around the numbers that the current government's talking about bringing into Australia. Now, things worked out quite well there. House price inflation was, it was there, but it was pretty minimal. Everyone got jobs pretty quickly, and even people that couldn't speak English got jobs. And things seemed to work out quite well. Now, it's very different today. Large numbers of people stay unemployed for long periods of time and claiming government benefits. A lot of those benefits, of course, didn't really exist in 1970. Some did, but not all. So we're talking about a different social security welfare system here. Also, there were no such things as, you get the odd one or two, but things like asylum seekers and refugees. It wasn't you didn't get that in the same way. You did get some, for example, in the 1970s after the Vietnam War, some Vietnamese were brought into Australia as refugees. So you did get some of that, but nothing like the scale that we see today. And by the way, they're bringing both the Christian Lebanese in from the Lebanese Civil War in the 70s and bringing the Vietnamese in has turned out to be an unmitigated disaster on all fronts, by the way. Nonetheless, let's go back to the success of immigration. That's legal immigration, not refugees, but legal immigration in. So, and I'll again use 1970s or 1970 as the main point of launching this essay. So let me look at a ship's manifest from an immigration ship coming from Europe. This is in 1969. Actually, this one I'm just looking at now. Pretty much everybody had a skill, and often both partners had a skill. Like he would be a carpenter and she would be a nurse, or he would be an architect and she would be an accountant, and so on. So often you had both parties had a job skill that were needed in Australia at the time. So the government was focusing on people who were in good health, preference given to younger children, and you couldn't bring over aunts, uncles, and so on unless you had a lot of money. So really it was younger families where one or both had skills. It wasn't mandatory that you spoke good English or perfect English, but you needed to have at least a working knowledge of English. So, or a member of the family did. Like if he spoke decent enough English, but she didn't, then that wasn't a problem as long as somebody spoke English. So the bar was set, I wouldn't say very high, but the bar was set decently high. You needed a qualification was recognised, some experience in the key areas that were considered necessary, things like trades and building and nursing and that sort of stuff, metallurgy or whatever. And you needed some sort of that, and you had to be able to at least speak English well enough to sort of get around and get by. Now, the government had instead of social security, they had these hostels, and it was like I don't know what you call your army barracks type setups where you could stay there. The women in this barracks, the children under a certain age with mothers in that barracks, and so on. You had canteens, so you were given free accommodation and bed linen and beds, and free accommodation and free food, and you were given interpreter services. There was a employment to labour exchange type employment offices that were in the, or not the smaller ones, but most of these hostels. So you had somewhere to stay while you're out looking for work. And then when you got, I think you had to get 4 or 6 weeks paychecks, and then you could go and you could leave the hostel and go and rent a place or buy a place or do whatever, but you could leave. So the average turnaround, I think, was 3 months in these places, even for people that didn't speak very good English. It was quite a success, and everyone seemed to get jobs quickly. And now there are a few differences in economic, the economic architecture, if you like, of the place at the time. And I'm speaking primarily of the big cities here, but you could probably look at something similar in the more rural areas. But somebody on a factory wage could buy a house in those days. And in Sydney, today Australia's most expensive city, the second most expensive city in the world for real estate, Sydney is. So you could buy a house on a factory worker's wage. Even taxi drivers could buy a house. People working on the checkout at the grocery store could afford to buy a house. The guy pumping, petrol or gasoline in the service station and who'd clean your windows and put some oil in your car, put the petrol in and all that stuff, he could afford to buy a house. Such was the purchasing power of the paycheck back then. So we're talking economically a very, very different landscape. So 75% of it, pretty much any full-time job back in the day was enough to buy a house, get married, have children. Now, that purchasing power today in Sydney, at least, is less than 5% of the population. Less than 5% of jobs pay enough money to have that same lifestyle today in Sydney. Now, in other cities where the pay is less, the cost of living is less, but on a relative basis, we're talking, more or less the same. Purchasing power has been just destroyed from the paycheck. So it's very different today. And the majority of jobs that are being created today are low-paid jobs. There's very few jobs. The higher paid jobs are often now concentrated in the gig economy, like the kick-ass computer programmer that's needed only for a 6-month project, and he's got to go and look for other work and so on. It may be a couple of months before he gets another gig. So that landscape has changed as well. Similarly, the best paid jobs now in Australia and in the West have moved away from productive jobs like factory manager or a skilled metallurgist or something like that. And the best paid jobs are now things like director of diversity, a special social worker on lesbian issues, and a human resources director whose job is to make sure that no straight white males get hired. Those are the globalist enablement type jobs are the ones that are paying the big bucks now. A guy, this was an advertised job a while ago, somebody to work 3 days a week to rustle up placard waving mobs out of university kids. That's a very well paid job. That's in the top 1% of well paid jobs in Australia. Just to rustle up placard wavers on demand. I mean, fuck. So it's a very different landscape now in terms of what's affordable, the jobs that can. So for people integrating in the economy now and having families and this sort of stuff, that's just gone out the window. It doesn't even exist anymore as an economically feasible lifestyle. So now when you're also the bar for the skills and so on and language skills has been lowered quite considerably. in order to ensure that black and brown people make up the disproportionate number of the immigrants. So it's a deliberate scam. So you're getting a lot of people coming in with no job skills and who speak poor or no English. Now, the government's response to this is to, under the direction of the globalists, I'm sure, is to just create additional jobs in the public service at local, state, and federal level. So the government expenditures have just gone through the fucking roof. I mean, there are entire new departments of government that are created just to give Indian immigrants jobs that they haven't earned or anything. Now, on top of that, the productivity nature of the Australian economy, the Western economies generally have changed. A lot of manufacturing jobs are sent offshore. Now, manufacturing jobs, it's easy to increase productivity. You can have more efficient procedures, better manufacturing equipment on the factory floor, better trained staff. So you can do a lot to fewer staff. More automation, these sorts of things. So through manufacturing, you can increase productivity. Well, there are many opportunities, avenues, and ways of increasing productivity. In service industries, particularly service industries that are simply invented in order to absorb the flow of unneeded, unwanted, unskilled third world immigrants, then productivity takes an absolute nosedive. I mean, it just goes through the floor. So we're talking about an economy that's far less productive, far less productive than it was in 1970. Not simply because a lot of manufactured jobs have been moved offshore. There's definitely that, but also because of the creation of zero productivity jobs simply to absorb these unwanted, unneeded migrants, particularly Indians, but also Chinese as well to a lesser extent. Now, in addition, because the numbers come in of migrants in 1970 were spread across 20 different nationalities, and the bulk of it coming from the British Isles, the British migrants integrated very quickly. Within a few years, the kids that came over from England were calling themselves Australian. One generation, that was it, full integration pretty much. May have taken a little bit longer with, say, Greek or something like this, but still the integration was swift compared to what it is today. And because of that integration, there were no sub-economies being created or racially based economies. But today there are huge sub-economies, subset economies of Indians and Chinese, even Russians to some extent, that are in Australia today that have no part of the wider economy. They do business with each other, amongst themselves, their relatives, amongst their own racial diaspora. And I've gone into numerous Chinese companies where there isn't a single Anglo face in sight, or Indian company. The Indian company is a little bit better. They'll employ some blonde chick, some dizzy little blonde chick to sit on the reception, just so the brown Brahmin boys have got a bit of Anglo blonde eye candy to check out. But apart from that, they're completely separate economies, which again are a dagger to the heart of a productive economy. So it's a very different scenario now. Those people from largely, I'm sure you can find an exception, but those people in the late 60s, 1970, they were far more skilled, had better language skills, recognised qualifications, or a far higher proportion of them did. I'm sure you could find ones that didn't. Chain migration wasn't really a thing back in the day. You couldn't just bring over your relatives. And in the third world, where they want to bring their relatives out from the third world basket case shithole, you don't have that. These are people that were coming in 1969, 1970. These were people coming from other first world countries primarily. So they didn't have anywhere near that sort of motivation to bring their relatives over, whereas today they do. So again, a very different dynamic in chain migration that was going on today as opposed to what was going on then. So we see the integration back in the 1960s in a vastly different environment with very different inputs and causation factors. And the situation today couldn't be less propitious for mass migration. Mass migration today is a fucking disaster of the first magnitude, whereas back then they were able to absorb those large, relative to population, absorb those large numbers without there being inflation was 1-2%, that sort of thing. Sure, I mean, did house prices increase? Yeah, but if you look at a chart or a graph of house prices increasing from say 1900 through to 1980, it was only when the banks, firstly, it was only when the banks started lowering the deposit. Instead of having 30% deposit, you could buy a house on 5% deposit, and then mass migration following very shortly after that. That's what kicked off the prices, and it's never stopped since. So, I mean, to give you an idea, a house that was bought in 1970, this is in Sydney, for $25,000. Today is valued at nearly $4 million. That just gives you an idea of the appreciation in real estate. Whereas a house that was bought in say 1930 for $1,200 would be in 1960 was $6,000. So you're looking at quite a small a relative rate of appreciation over that time. So where you're looking at, if you look at say 30 years today, you're looking at a much higher rate of appreciation and launching off a much higher price to begin with. Similarly, if you look at the purchasing power of wages at the time and the increase in wages, even though inflation was low, because the economy was compared to today quite productive, you could absorb price increases through wages. So wages were increasing because of the economy is so productive, and that's why inflation was on a relative basis quite low at the time. And they recorded inflation very differently then. They recorded inflation the same way, while real estate prices were going hysterical, they recorded inflation the same way as they were then. Then inflation would be running at 10 to 12% a year for the last 25 years. So again, those things. So these are the different. This is why mass migration today isn't panning out anywhere anything like it was back in the 1970s and the late 1960s. Different sort of migrants, different sort of environment coming into the country, very different spread of jobs and a vastly different purchasing power and the paycheck, and all these things made a very successful migration program in those days, and the opposite that's happening today makes a very unsuccessful migration program. You've been with Tacitus today, your Pushback channel. Thank you for listening.